Ruth Davis had always been a woman of quiet strength. She wasn't a flashy person. In fact, most people barely noticed her. Ruth worked as a cleaning lady at a large corporate office, a place where the suits and ties of the corporate world dominated the scene. She spent her days mopping floors, dusting shelves, and taking out trash. Every day was the same, and most of the employees barely acknowledged her presence. In the mornings, Ruth would arrive early, before the office crowd, and start her day with a cup of coffee from the staff lounge. She would wipe down counters, clean the restrooms, and make sure every office was spotless. Ruth had always taken pride in her work, even though most of the employees seemed to ignore her. They would rush past her in the hallways, barely noticing her as they typed away on their phones or chatted about their weekend plans. Ruth didn't mind the solitude. In fact, she often preferred it. She wasn't one to make a lot of noise or draw attention to herself, but she was also incredibly observant. As she cleaned, she listened. She heard the conversations between coworkers. She overheard complaints about the boss, Mr. Hargrove, the CEO of the company. They often laughed at him behind his back, calling him out for his poor decisions and stubbornness. Ruth never joined in the laughter. She just listened quietly, her mop gliding across the floor as she soaked in every detail. The employees seemed to think Ruth was just a cleaning lady who didn't understand their world. They would often talk about their problems with the company, how they didn't like the latest project, how they felt Mr. Hargrove's leadership was failing. They would laugh about how he made terrible choices, running the company into the ground. They even joked that the company might soon close its doors. But Ruth wasn't as naive as they thought. She had worked at that office for years, and over time, she had learned more about the business world than anyone could have imagined. Ruth loved to read. After finishing her work each night, she would spend her evenings reading books on business, leadership, and strategy. She was fascinated by how companies ran, how leaders made decisions, and how businesses grew. Ruth had a sharp mind, and though no one knew it, she understood much more about the business than anyone gave her credit for. She had even noticed the small problems the employees complained about, the unethical practices, the waste of resources, and the risky decisions Mr. Hargrove was making. Ruth knew these issues were affecting the company. She could see how employees were becoming demotivated, how productivity was slipping, and how the company's reputation was being damaged. But Ruth was patient. She never spoke up. She wasn't there to make waves. She was just the cleaning lady after all. But inside, Ruth couldn't help but think that if she were in charge, she could turn things around. She could fix the mess the company was in. But who would listen to her? She was just Ruth Davis, the woman with a mop and a broom. But little did the employees know, Ruth was more than just a cleaning lady. She had ideas, and one day, those ideas would change everything. As the days went by, Ruth's role as the office cleaning lady continued, but she was far more than what the others saw. Every morning, she arrived at the office before the busy employees, prepared to do her job without complaint. While she wiped down desks, cleaned windows, and swept the floors, her mind was always active. Ruth had become a silent observer, noticing everything around her. She had seen how the company was running into trouble. The employees seemed frustrated, not with their work, but with the way things were being managed. They often gathered in the break room, talking about how things had gotten worse over the past few months. Ruth listened closely. She heard how the company's expenses were increasing while profits were shrinking. They complained about Mr. Hargrove, the CEO, whose decisions didn't seem to make sense. His focus on expensive projects and poor investments was hurting the company's bottom line. Ruth didn't join in the conversations. She didn't have time for gossip, but she couldn't help but hear the talk. Every time she cleaned an office, she'd hear whispers of discontent. The employees didn't realize that Ruth, in her quiet way, understood everything they were saying. She knew that these small problems, if left unchecked, would soon become bigger ones. But she also knew the company didn't have to fail. It could be saved. What the employees didn't know was that Ruth had been quietly studying business and leadership for years. After finishing her work every night, she would sit at her small kitchen table with books on business strategies, leadership, and management. She spent hours reading, learning from some of the best minds in the world. Ruth understood what needed to be done to turn things around. The company didn't need a new CEO. It needed a new way of thinking. One day, Ruth decided it was time to take action. She knew she couldn't sit by anymore and watch the company crumble. The employees needed someone to speak up, and if no one else would, then it had to be her. She quietly began taking notes in her journal, writing down the changes she thought the company needed. Ruth had ideas that could save the company, ideas that would reduce waste, improve employee morale, and get the business back on track. But the question was, who would listen? As Ruth walked the halls of the office one morning, mopping the floors, she noticed Sarah, a young junior employee, sitting at her desk, staring at her computer screen. Sarah had always been kind to Ruth. She never saw her as just a cleaning lady. She had often stopped to chat with Ruth about her day, and Ruth had always enjoyed their brief conversations. Today, Sarah looked worried, and Ruth could tell something was bothering her. Ruth approached Sarah's desk and asked, "Is everything okay?" Sarah looked up, surprised but grateful for Ruth's concern. "I'm just frustrated," she said, sighing. "I don't know how much longer the company can go on like this. Everything feels like it's falling apart." Ruth's heart sank. She had been feeling the same way. But instead of simply agreeing, Ruth spoke gently. "Maybe it's not too late. Maybe there's a way to fix things. What if you and I worked together to figure it out?" Sarah blinked, unsure of what Ruth meant. How could we possibly fix all of this? Ruth smiled softly, her eyes gleaming with quiet determination. "We might be able to do something more than you think." Ruth's suggestion to Sarah wasn't something she'd made lightly. She had been thinking about it for days, trying to find a way to help the company without drawing attention to herself. The idea of speaking up had always seemed risky, but Ruth could feel that something needed to be done. Watching the company struggle, watching employees lose hope, it was becoming too much. She couldn't stand by anymore. Sarah sat at her desk, still processing Ruth's words. "But how could we possibly change anything? I'm just a junior employee, and you're the cleaning lady. No one would listen to us." Ruth leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "It's not about the titles. It's about the ideas. Sometimes people don't notice what's right in front of them because they're too caught up in the system. If we think differently, we might just have the answers." Sarah hesitated, unsure if Ruth was serious. "You really think we can fix all of this?" Ruth nodded. "I know we can. We just need to start small, make a plan, and get it into the right hands. Together, we might be able to change the way things are run." Sarah thought about Ruth's words for a moment. She had always known Ruth was smarter than people realized, but she hadn't expected her to offer such a bold idea. Sarah's uncertainty began to fade, replaced by curiosity. "Okay, I'm in. But where do we start?" Ruth smiled, feeling the surge of hope. "First, we need to gather information. We need to know what's really going on, from the top down. Start by taking note of the things that aren't working. Things like missed deadlines, wasteful spending, or low morale. We'll write everything down, then figure out what's causing the issues." Sarah nodded, her energy growing. "That sounds like a good place to start. But what happens after we figure it out?" "We need to present the information to the people who can make a change," Ruth said. "But we need to do it in a way that shows we thought things through, that we got real solutions. We can't just complain. We need to propose better ways to run the business." Sarah looked at Ruth, a new respect in her eyes. "You really know what you're talking about, don't you?" Ruth chuckled softly. "I've been paying attention for a long time. And sometimes the answers are simpler than people think. We just need to take a step back and look at things from a different angle." With Ruth's plan in place, Sarah and Ruth began working together in secret. During the day, Ruth continued her cleaning duties, but her mind was constantly working, reviewing everything she had learned about the company's problems. Sarah, on the other hand, started to observe her coworkers more closely, taking notes when she saw mistakes, inefficiencies, or areas for improvement. The days turned into weeks, and slowly but surely, they compiled a detailed report. They didn't just write about the issues. They proposed solutions. Ruth's insight into cost-saving measures, improvements in communication, and ways to boost employee morale were impressive. Sarah was amazed by Ruth's understanding of the business world. It was clear that Ruth wasn't just a cleaning lady. She was a problem solver. One afternoon, Sarah looked at the report they had put together, her heart pounding. "This is it, Ruth. We got something that could actually help." Ruth looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "Now we just need to get it into the right hands." The next step in Ruth's plan was risky, but she knew it was necessary. With Sarah's help, they had gathered all the information they could. They had written down every problem they noticed, along with the solutions they thought could work. Now it was time to get their ideas into the hands of the people who could make a difference. Ruth knew that the right person needed to see the report, the person who could actually use the ideas to bring about change. She couldn't just hand it to anyone in the office. Most people wouldn't take it seriously, and if it landed in the wrong hands, it could be ignored. "Who do you think we should give it to?" Sarah asked, looking at the report nervously. "The CEO might just laugh at us." Ruth thought for a moment, looking at the report they'd worked so hard on. "I think we should start with the board members. They're the ones who can push things through. But we need to make sure they understand that these aren't just complaints. These are practical, thought-out solutions." Sarah wasn't sure. "But how will we even get in touch with them? They're busy, and we're just, well, just the cleaning lady and the junior employee." Ruth smiled, her eyes shining with quiet confidence. "It's not about titles. It's about making them realize that we have something worth hearing. They may not know me, but they'll know this report is important. If they see how much we fought this through, they'll have to pay attention." The two women decided to take a bold step. They would send the report to the board anonymously. But how would they get the report into their hands without drawing attention? That evening, as Ruth was finishing her cleaning shift, she saw a familiar face walking toward her. It was Mr. Thompson, one of the board members. He was usually a quiet man, but Ruth had seen him around the office often. He seemed like someone who genuinely cared about the company. Unlike Mr. Hargrove, the CEO, Ruth had heard him speak in meetings and noticed he always asked thoughtful questions. This was her chance. Ruth took a deep breath and walked toward him. "Mr. Thompson," she said politely, smiling as she stood in front of him. "I have something I'd like to give you. I think it could really help the company." He paused and looked at her curiously. "What's this about, Ruth?" "I've been working on something," she said, holding out a folder containing the report. "I believe it addresses some of the issues we've been facing here. If you have a moment, I'd like you to look at it." Mr. Thompson looked at her for a moment, then took the folder from her hand. "All right, I'll take a look. Thank you." Ruth watched as he walked away, feeling both nervous and hopeful. She had done it. The report was now in the hands of someone who could actually make a difference. Back in her small apartment, Ruth sat down at her kitchen table, her mind racing. "I hope he sees the value in it," she whispered to herself. "I hope he does something." The next few days felt like an eternity. Ruth continued with her usual routine, but she couldn't stop thinking about the report. She wondered if Mr. Thompson had read it, if he would act on it, or if it would just be another forgotten idea. Then, one morning, she received a surprise. She was cleaning the conference room when Sarah rushed in, her face bright with excitement. "Ruth, the board is meeting today. They're talking about the report." Ruth's heart skipped a beat. "They're actually listening." Sarah grinned. "They're talking about your ideas. They're impressed." Ruth couldn't believe it. The first step of her plan had worked. Now, the next challenge was ahead, getting the board to take action. The days after the board meeting felt like a blur to Ruth. The fact that the board had taken her reports seriously was incredible, but it also left her with a feeling of nervous excitement. She had done something that no one expected, and now she could only hope that the board members would actually take the next step and make the changes the company desperately needed. Sarah had been keeping Ruth updated on the discussions. The board seemed impressed with the ideas, especially the cost-saving measures Ruth had suggested and the changes to improve employee morale. But there was one problem. Mr. Hargrove, the CEO, had dismissed the report almost immediately. Ruth wasn't surprised. He'd always been stubborn. But she knew the board would eventually see that his leadership was the real problem. One morning, Ruth was quietly cleaning the office lobby when Sarah came rushing in, her face bright with excitement. "Ruth, guess what? The board is meeting again today. And this time, they're talking about making real changes. They're thinking about replacing Mr. Hargrove." Ruth's heart skipped a beat. "What? They're really going to do it?" Sarah nodded. "They're discussing it seriously. They said the company needs someone who can make the tough decisions, and Mr. Hargrove hasn't been doing that." Ruth couldn't believe it. She had watched Mr. Hargrove make one poor decision after another, but she never imagined that the board would actually be considering removing him. It felt like a victory already, but Ruth knew the real challenge was just beginning. If the company was going to survive, it needed more than just a change at the top. It needed a complete shift in how things were done. That afternoon, Ruth was cleaning near the CEO's office when she heard voices. She stopped, trying to stay quiet and out of sight, but she could hear the conversation clearly through the open door. Mr. Hargrove was arguing with several of the board members. His voice was loud and angry. "I've been running this company for years. How dare you question my decisions? You're making a huge mistake." One of the board members, Mr. Daniels, responded calmly. "With all due respect, Mr. Hargrove, we've seen the financial reports. Your decisions are putting us at risk. We need someone who can lead the company through these difficult times, and it's clear you're not that person anymore." Ruth felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and relief. She had known for a long time that Mr. Hargrove's leadership was holding the company back, but to hear the board members say it aloud was a moment of triumph. The change she had been hoping for was finally coming. The next morning, the announcement was made. Mr. Hargrove was being removed as CEO, and the board would begin searching for a new leader. Ruth could hardly believe it. Her plan, her quiet observations, and her willingness to speak up had led to this moment. As Ruth cleaned the offices that day, she couldn't help but smile. She had never imagined that a cleaning lady like her could have such an impact on a major company. But it wasn't about her title. It was about seeing the problems, having the courage to do something about them, and knowing that change was possible. But the battle wasn't over yet. The board still needed to make the right choice for the company's new leadership. Ruth knew the job wasn't finished, and she wasn't going to stop now. She had proven she could make a difference, and now she was determined to see the company thrive under new leadership. The announcement of Mr. Hargrove's removal as CEO spread quickly throughout the office. Employees were talking about it in the break room, in the hallways, even at their desks. Ruth could overhear their excited conversations as she went about her cleaning duties. Everyone seemed relieved, even hopeful that things might finally improve. As the days passed, the board began the search for a new CEO. They held interviews and reviewed many candidates, but Ruth knew that finding the right person wouldn't be easy. The company needed someone who could not only lead effectively, but also understand the importance of listening to the employees and making decisions that would benefit everyone, not just the bottom line. One morning, as Ruth was dusting the conference room, she overheard a conversation between two senior managers. "Do you think the board will hire someone from outside, or will they promote someone from within?" one of them asked. The other manager shrugged. "I don't know, but we need someone who understands how the company works. It's going to be tough to fix all the problems Hargrove caused." Ruth paused, thinking to herself, the company didn't just need someone who understood how things worked. It needed someone who was willing to make changes, someone who could see the big picture and think beyond the usual way of doing things. Ruth didn't have the formal business experience that most candidates would have, but she had something else: insight. She had seen the problems from the inside and had already started thinking about solutions. She couldn't shake the feeling that the right person for the job might already be in the office. Someone who knew the employees, understood the struggles, and cared about fixing the issues. She didn't know if the board would be open to the idea, but what if they could see that the company needed someone like her to help guide it through the challenges ahead? That night, after finishing her shift, Ruth sat down at her small kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. She thought carefully about what the company needed, what it would take to turn things around. She wrote down her thoughts, focusing on what she had seen during her time working in the office. She had ideas about improving communication, motivating employees, and cutting unnecessary costs. Ruth believed that if the board was serious about saving the company, they needed to think outside the box. The next morning, Ruth decided to take another bold step. She knew that she couldn't do this alone, but she also knew that she had to try. She approached Sarah, who was now more than just a coworker. She had become Ruth's ally in this journey. "Sarah," Ruth said quietly, "I think I need to do more than just help with ideas. I think I need to step up and be part of the solution." Sarah looked at her in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I'm going to send my ideas to the board. I've been thinking a lot about what this company really needs, and I believe I can help. It's a risk, but I have to do it." Sarah stared at her for a moment, then smiled. "Ruth, I think you're right. You've been thinking about this longer than anyone. You know what's needed." With Sarah's encouragement, Ruth put together a detailed proposal for the board. It wasn't just a list of problems. It was a plan for real change. She included everything from improving employee training to creating a more transparent communication system between departments. She even suggested a mentoring program to help younger employees develop leadership skills. Ruth knew it wouldn't be easy to convince the board, but she was determined to try. Ruth sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the proposal she had put together. It was simple, yet full of ideas that she believed could truly make a difference in the company. She had written everything with care: the problems she had observed, the changes that needed to be made, and the solution she thought would work. But now, the hardest part was ahead: getting the board to take her seriously. She had already made an impact by anonymously sending her initial report. Now Ruth was going to take a bigger risk by presenting her full plan directly to the board. It was a huge step, but she knew she had no choice if she wanted the company to survive and grow. The next morning, Ruth handed her proposal to Sarah, who had become her ally throughout this journey. Sarah was nervous but excited about Ruth's courage. "You're really doing this?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with awe. Ruth nodded, determination in her eyes. "I have to. If I don't speak up now, I'll regret it. This is the only chance we have to make things right." Sarah took a deep breath and gave Ruth a reassuring smile. "You've got this, Ruth. Just remember, you've been right about everything so far. You know what needs to change." Ruth felt a wave of gratitude for Sarah's support. It was strange, but in a way, Sarah had become the person who gave her the confidence to move forward. She wasn't alone in this anymore. Later that day, Ruth took her proposal and made her way to the boardroom. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She had worked hard to stay quiet, to be invisible, but now she had to stand up and speak, even if it meant putting herself in the spotlight. The door to the boardroom loomed ahead, and Ruth hesitated for just a moment before pushing it open. Inside, the board members were seated around the large conference table. Mr. Daniels, who had seemed open to change from the start, gave her a nod of recognition. But most of the others didn't seem to notice her at first. After all, she was just Ruth, the cleaning lady, the one who had quietly observed the company for years. But Ruth didn't let that discourage her. She stepped into the room with a calm confidence, holding her proposal firmly in her hands. She placed the papers on the table and looked around at the board members. "Good afternoon," she said softly, but her voice carried enough strength to be heard. "I have something I'd like to share with you. I believe these ideas can help turn this company around." The board members exchanged surprised glances. Ruth could see the skepticism in their eyes. They were used to hearing from experts, not someone like her. But she didn't back down. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "I've been working here for a long time," she began. "And during that time, I've seen both the strengths and the weaknesses in this company. But what I've also seen is that there are a lot of things we can do differently, better. I believe this company can thrive, but only if we're willing to make some important changes." Ruth went on to explain her ideas: improving employee morale, cutting wasteful expenses, and most importantly, focusing on what really mattered: people. She explained how better communication, more training, and recognizing the value of every employee could boost productivity and build trust within the company. As she spoke, Ruth saw the board members leaning forward, listening more intently. Even Mr. Hargrove, who was still hanging around after his removal, seemed to be paying attention. Ruth didn't know if they would agree with everything she had said, but she could feel that they were starting to take her seriously. When she finished, Ruth looked at the board members, her heart still racing. "These changes won't be easy, but I truly believe they're necessary. If we don't make them, I'm afraid the company won't survive." The room was silent for a moment, but then Mr. Daniels spoke. "Ruth," he said, his voice full of respect, "thank you for your honesty and your ideas. We'll take this seriously. This is exactly the kind of thinking we need." The days that followed Ruth's presentation felt like a whirlwind. The board had taken her ideas seriously, and the company was beginning to see the first signs of change. Ruth couldn't help but feel proud of herself, though she knew the hard work was far from over. The company needed a new leader, someone who could follow through on the changes that were beginning to take shape. In the weeks that followed, the board continued its search for a new CEO. They didn't rush the process. Ruth's ideas had opened their eyes to the importance of leadership that focused on people, not just profits. They needed someone who understood the importance of communication, motivation, and transparency. Someone who could inspire the employees to believe in the company again. One afternoon, Sarah approached Ruth as she was cleaning the main lobby. "Ruth, I heard the board has finally made a decision," Sarah said, her voice full of excitement. "They've chosen a new CEO." Ruth's heart skipped a beat. "Really? Who?" Sarah grinned. "It's someone from inside the company. Someone who knows what's going on and is willing to make the changes we need." Ruth's curiosity grew. She didn't know if she was ready for another surprise, but she was hopeful. The idea of someone within the company stepping up gave her a sense of optimism. Later that day, the announcement was made. The new CEO was none other than Mr. Daniels, the board member who had seemed most open to Ruth's ideas. Ruth couldn't believe it. She had worked with Mr. Daniels on a few occasions, and though he was quiet and reserved, he always seemed thoughtful and fair. If anyone could lead the company through this transformation, it was him. The first meeting with the new CEO was held in the conference room. Ruth was nervous as she walked in to clean, knowing that this was a pivotal moment. She wasn't sure if her ideas had made a lasting impact, but she was proud of what she had done. As she polished the table, she couldn't help but overhear the conversation between Mr. Daniels and the other board members. "We're going to need to make some bold moves," Mr. Daniels said, his voice calm but full of purpose. "But I'm committed to doing what's best for the company. We'll start by focusing on employee morale and communication. Ruth Davis, the cleaning lady, has already made a great start. I plan to build on her ideas." Ruth's heart swelled with pride. Mr. Daniels was talking about her ideas, acknowledging the work she had done. She couldn't believe it. She had been just the cleaning lady, but now her vision was being embraced by the new CEO. The changes began slowly but steadily. Mr. Daniels held meetings with employees, encouraging them to share their thoughts and ideas. He focused on improving the company's internal communication, creating a more open and supportive environment. Ruth's ideas about cutting waste and saving costs were put into action, and soon the company started to see real improvements. As weeks passed, Ruth noticed that the atmosphere in the office had changed. Employees were more engaged, more motivated, and more willing to collaborate. The company's financial situation began to improve, and there was a renewed sense of hope among the staff. People were excited about the future again, and Ruth felt like she had played a small part in making it happen. One evening, after finishing her shift, Mr. Daniels called Ruth into his office. "Ruth," he said with a smile, "I want to thank you for everything you've done. You've inspired all of us. Without your ideas, we wouldn't be where we are today." Ruth was speechless. "I just did what I thought was right," she said softly. "And that's exactly why we need more people like you in leadership positions," Mr. Daniels replied. "Thank you, Ruth. You've truly made a difference." Ruth left his office that day feeling more proud than she had ever felt before. She had started as a cleaning lady, unnoticed and unappreciated. But through her quiet observations and determination, she had changed the course of an entire company. And though she didn't seek recognition, she knew she had made a lasting impact on the people who worked alongside her. Ruth couldn't believe how far she had come. What started as a quiet, unnoticed job as a cleaning lady had turned into something much more significant. She had helped save a company, brought positive changes, and even played a role in selecting a new CEO. But despite all the success and praise, Ruth had never sought recognition. She had always believed in doing what was right, even if no one noticed. The company was now on a path of recovery. Under the leadership of Mr. Daniels, Ruth's ideas had become a key part of the company's strategy. Employees were happier, productivity was rising, and the financial situation was improving. The atmosphere in the office had shifted from one of uncertainty and frustration to one of hope and possibility. One day, as Ruth was cleaning the break room, Sarah walked in, a wide smile on her face. "Ruth, I heard the company is going to give you an award for everything you've done. Isn't that amazing?" Ruth looked up, surprised. "An award? I didn't do this for recognition, Sarah. I just wanted to help." I know," Sarah said, grinning. "But you've earned it. You've helped more than you know. People are talking about you. Everyone's so grateful for what you've done. You're the reason we have a chance to turn this around." Ruth felt a mixture of surprise and modesty. She hadn't expected any recognition, but she was glad the employees were benefiting from the changes. She didn't need an award to feel proud of what had been accomplished. Later that week, the company held a meeting to celebrate the progress they had made. Ruth sat in the back of the room, as always, quietly observing. Mr. Daniels stood at the front, addressing the employees with pride. "I want to thank everyone for their hard work," he said, his voice full of appreciation. "But there's one person who has made a bigger impact than most realize. Ruth Davis, our cleaning lady, has been the one to guide us in the right direction. She may not have a title, but she has shown us what true leadership looks like." Ruth's face turned red as all eyes in the room turned to her. She felt awkward, but there was no denying the pride in her heart. She had never imagined her quiet observations would lead to such a moment. She had helped the company, not for praise or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. After the meeting, Ruth was approached by several employees, all eager to thank her for her efforts. "You've changed the whole company," one of them said. "We never thought the cleaning lady had such great ideas. You've taught us all a lesson in leadership and dedication." Ruth smiled softly, grateful for their kind words, but she remained humble. "I just did what I thought was best," she replied. "I didn't want to see this company fail. It's not about titles or awards. It's about doing what's right." In the weeks that followed, Ruth continued with her cleaning duties. But now she was more than just the cleaning lady. She was respected, valued, and remembered for the role she played in saving the company. She had proven that anyone, no matter their job or background, could make a difference. All it took was the willingness to act, to speak up, and to believe in the power of positive change. Ruth's stories spread throughout the office, inspiring others to look beyond their titles and roles and to see the potential for change in every situation. She had started as a humble cleaning lady, but in the end, she became the unsung hero who helped bring the company back to life.